Bethany Bethay with Alliance Wealth Builders, Alabama's premier turnkey real estate provider. In order to determine if a turnkey real estate property is right for you, you want to consider all the financials. In order to do this, one of the best ways and tools to utilize is a proforma. Today we're going to discuss how to read one of our proformas. This proforma is a typical proforma for a Alliance Wealth Builders turnkey property. You'll notice that the top left-hand corner includes the address, and then the right-hand corner includes my contact information. The two most important numbers to look at for any turnkey property are going to be the purchase price and the gross rent. You'll see the purchase information on the left-hand side. The purchase price for this property is $86,900. With our properties, that number includes the acquisition, the rehab, and the tenant placement. To the right, you'll notice under the income, you see the gross rent. This property will rent for around $895 per month, and then of course the annual rent is $10,740. Now let's look at the purchase info. If you go back to the left-hand side, you'll notice again the purchase price is $86,900. Beneath that, you see the first mortgage. Now scroll down just a little bit and you'll see mortgages. Now we are assuming a few things on this proforma. We do not know for a fact what interest rates are going to be, exactly what interest rate you will get when you're financing a property. So we do have to assume those factors. Now, if you are not financing, if you're going to pay cash for this property, then of course you can take this out of your equation. Now what we assume here is a loan to cost ratio and a loan to value ratio of 80%. So that means that assuming you put down 20% down payment on this property, then you will finance the remaining 80%. The loan amount in that case, which would be 80% of the purchase price, is that $69,520. We assume it's an amortizing loan and a 30-year fixed rate at 5.5%. Now we do adjust our interest rates with the times basically. We cannot guarantee what interest rate that you will receive. However, we do work with our lenders to try to be as accurate as we can on what the current rates are. That is why this proforma is reflecting 5.5%. However, you definitely want to do your due diligence and check with your lender to see what your rate would be. Now with all of that considered, we have an estimated payment amount of $394.73. So let's go back up to the top here. So that's where that first mortgage is subtracted, and that gives you a down payment of $17,380, which will be 20% of the purchase price. Now you notice we don't have a second mortgage on here. Obviously that would be your discretion, and we could factor that in if necessary. One of the biggest questions I receive on our proformas is this buying cost, this $5,214. Now that does seem like a really high number and people want to know what that includes. So with this, that is our estimated closing cost. So we have no clue what your actual closing costs are going to be, because that is going to depend very largely on which lender you use, what their origination fees are, how much their appraisal cost. There's just a lot of factors in a closing cost that we have absolutely no control over. Alliance Wealth Builders does not charge anything for that number. That is just an estimate. It's actually 6% is what we estimate for closing costs, because that's going to have to include, title, insurance, origination fees, upfront charges. So that number could vary dramatically. Hopefully that will be less for you, but that is again something that you will need to check with your lender on to determine a more accurate figure for what your actual closing costs will be. Again, we do like to estimate 6% because we prefer to overestimate, hopefully, and have a smaller number, but again, that's going to depend entirely on what your lender determines. Now you'll notice that there is no number for initial improvements, and that is because the rehab is already included in the purchase price. So when you take that purchase price, subtract the first mortgage, add the buying cost, and that will give you your initial cash invested, which is basically your down payment and closing cost, estimated here at $22,594. Beneath that, you see the square feet. That is the square footage for the property. To estimate that cost per square footage, obviously they take the purchase price divided by the square footage. Monthly rent per square footage would be the same. So let's move over to the right hand column now and look at the income. Again, we estimate that gross rent at $895. Now the vacancy loss underneath, so when we run a pro forma, again, we always prefer to overestimate. We always want to be very conservative on our numbers because we want this to be as realistic as possible for our owners. So we include 5% vacancy loss in this equation. So that would be basically at some point in the future you're going to have a loss from a vacancy. There's almost no way to avoid at some point there being a change of tenant. So hopefully you won't have it for years, but there will eventually be a cost incurred when there's a tenant turnover. So we'd rather go ahead and include that, and that way you can be putting this money aside so when that does happen, you won't have any surprises. So we do include, again, 5% for vacancy, and that is that $45 monthly or $537 annually. That is subtracted to give you your operating income. Now beneath, if you'll look at expenses, same thing, cleaning and maintenance, that is also a 5% estimate. Again, we include 5% for vacancy and maintenance because eventually, unfortunately, there will be a maintenance item. So you definitely want to make sure to factor that into the equation and be putting that money aside for when that does happen. Now insurance, we use the numbers that we receive from our insurance provider. Now that is of course going to vary depending on which insurance provider that you choose. So I would be happy to give you our referral, but if you choose another insurance provider, then that number is going to vary dramatically. So again, that is an estimate, but we try to be as realistic as we can. Management fees, we charge 10% per property until you buy 3 or more investment properties. So this pro forma factors in 10%. If you were to own 3 or more properties, then that would be 9%. As far as the taxes, I try to use the previous year's tax assessment so that will give you an accurate representation of what you would probably be paying in the current year. However, Alabama does have some exemptions that a property may be tax exempt, and so in some cases I do have to estimate, but I do try to be as close to what you will actually pay as possible. You can double check on the courthouse retrieval system and make sure that this number is reflective of what the property paid last year. However, like I said, that can vary, so I definitely just try to be as accurate as possible. Association fees, this property does not have an association fee. Most of our properties do not. Most of our properties are older and they will not have an association. However, some of our newer properties that are in more of a pre-planned development neighborhood may have an association fee, and if they do, that will be included there. So once you take all of those items and add them up, you get your operating expense of $246 monthly. Then if you scroll down to your net performance, you'll see your net operating income of $604. So that is taking your operating income minus your operating expenses. And we subtract that mortgage payment that was calculated over on the left-hand side, and that will give you your cash flow. Now to me, cash flow is the most important number on this pro forma. If you're only going to look at 3 numbers on a pro forma, you want to look at the purchase price, the gross rent, and the cash flow. I really think that that's going to give you the most accurate assessment of how your property is going to perform. Assuming that all of these conditions are met and you actually do have the expenses assumed above, this property is going to cash flow around $210 per month or $2,517 per year. Now if we scroll down to the left-hand side, you'll see the financial metrics for year 1. The first thing we see here is the annual gross rent multiplier. That is the ratio of the price of an investment to its annual rental income before accounting for expenses. So this is the number of years the property would take to pay for itself. So in this case, the property in this scenario would pay for itself in around 8 years. Next, you see the operating expense ratio. This is the measure of what it costs to operate the property compared to the income that the property brings in. And it's calculated by dividing the property's operating expense by its gross operating income. So this one we're looking at around 28.9%. The debt coverage ratio measures the ability of the property to pay the monthly mortgage payments from the cash generated from renting the property. So your lender is going to use this number to determine whether the property will generate enough cash to pay its expenses and then still pay the mortgage payments. So in this case, the debt coverage ratio is 1.53. Next, the cap rate is the rate of return of an investment property based on the income the property is expected to generate. And this number is calculated by dividing the net operating income by the current market value. This gives the investor an estimate of potential rate of return on the property. A lot of people do like to use cap rate as a financial metric to determine if it's a good investment. In this case, you're looking at around 8.3%. And then another really important number to look at is the cash on cash return. Some investors prefer to look at the cap rate. Some investors prefer to look at the cash on cash return. The cash on cash return calculates the annual return the investor made in the property in relation to the cash that was invested. Typically, when you're financing, that would be the down payment that you have in there. This property has an 11.1% cash on cash return. So these are just all financial metrics that investors use to help determine if this property looks like a good investment. It also helps to compare this property to other similar properties. Finally, the assumptions on the bottom left. The appreciation rate, we use 3%. That is because Birmingham is a very flat market, as we've discussed in previous videos. Birmingham is just not a huge appreciation market. It's more of a cash flow market, and our average appreciation rate is around 3%. Again, the vacancy rate, we use 5%. And then the income and the expense inflation rate, these really don't factor into this pro forma at all. Also bearing in mind that it's not an appreciation market, we just have it at a very low 1%. And then finally, this LTV for refinance is 70%. Typically, when you refinance a property, you're going to get a loan of around 70 to 75%. But again, that is specific to your lender. And again, these assumptions really don't factor into any of the numbers when you're looking at this specific pro forma. If you look to the bottom of our pro forma, you will notice that we do include a disclaimer. We're basically saying that real estate investments are subject to risk and loss. We have no idea how this property is actually going to perform. Of course, we are going to do everything in our power to make sure that you achieve your goals and you meet your expectations. However, we do want to make sure that you understand that this pro forma is just an estimate. Please note that when you do look at any pro forma, ours or anyone else's, that it does include vacancy, maintenance, taxes, insurance, management. It's so important that all of these items are considered, even if they don't happen in the first year, because eventually they will factor into your numbers, and you want to make sure that you have the most accurate picture of how this property is going to perform. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you found it educational. Please contact me if you have any questions. I'd love to help you find your next investment.